Morning, good afternoon, good evening. Uh, Let me begin by thanking the Caribbean Water and Wastewater Association Technical Committee for selecting my paper for presentation, my abstract for presentation at this first virtual Caribbean Water and Wastewater Association annual conference and exhibition, and particular to share some thoughts as it relates to the issue of waste management, both solid and liquid waste management, and the potential and the development of the Caribbean blue economy. I'd like to begin by taking a journey through the Caribbean Sea, a sea full of complexities, whether it be mass tourism, cruise ship tourism, or subsistence fishing, and to look at the severe challenge that all of our governments face in dealing with the issue of solid and liquid waste management, and to look at this not just as an issue that is going to jeopardize our ability to develop blue economy approaches, but also to look at how can we position the issue of waste management as an opportunity within the blue economy. Importantly, it's about finding the right balance, the balance between maximizing environmental benefits, maximizing social benefits, and yes, also maximizing economic benefits, because that's the foundation of a sustainable ocean based or blue economy. So, how can we sustainably develop and utilize these benefits within the boundaries that the planet has set and avoid our past mistakes from inadequate land use practices and poor land based developments? And recognizing that our Caribbean Sea is unique and special. While we only represent 1% of the global ocean space, it contains 20% of the globally significant marine biodiversity, 8 to 35% of which are endemic, and comprises of 40 small island developing states and territories with a population approaching 40 million. What do we have to lose? US 407 billion was the estimate of gross revenues generated by the ocean economy in the Caribbean Sea. 311 billion coming from shipping, 53 billion purely for the island states and territories. And if you look at tourism, and particularly the tourism associated with coral reefs, 7.9 billion. And fisheries, despite being the lowest, the recognition that although at 5 billion, fisheries tends to be an extremely important enterprise for rural sector of society, subsistence fishing, and very much linked with the issue of food security and aquaculture. And here we have a great potential, even though valued at 1.9 billion, there's definitely a potential to improve and increase that, especially as it relates to mariculture. So as we look at the business case or the blue case, and I acknowledge the contribution of the World Resources Institute for this image, why do we need to invest in waste management, and recognizing that Caribbean small island developing states are the most tourism dependent in the world? Tourism is the largest economic activity, accounting for an average of 45% of the region's gross domestic product. And as we look at the integration between pollution, the capacity, institutional deficiencies that we face, the ecological impacts, and the sectors which are impacted, more and more the importance of addressing blue economy in an integrated way and recognizing the importance of addressing all the sources of waste come forward. Whether the pollution sources come from domestic or industrial wastewater, whether from urban solid waste, agricultural runoff, fertilizers and nutrients, or oil and mining industries, there are some core challenges that many of our governments face. Limited access to sanitation, poor wastewater treatment for a number of reasons, lack of financing, lack of policy, poor operations and maintenance. We've heard of the challenges with waste collection and disposal, sanitary landfill sites not being adequately managed, improper enforcement, lack of regulations. And we're seeing this in terms of the direct ecological impacts, whether it be bacterial contamination, eutrophication from excess nutrients, biomagnification, biological magnification of certain pollutants, and direct habitat degradation, all of which have significant potential economic impacts on the sectors that we so commonly associate with blue and ocean-based economies: tourism, fisheries, coastal development, and importantly, direct impacts on human health. I wanted to give a couple of highlights from a report which we finished last year and which we hope to launch in a month or so, a State of Convention Area Report on Marine Pollution, produced by EU, the UN Environment, UNEP's Caribbean Environment Program, and the Cartegena Convention Secretariat specifically. All the indicators that were analyzed at country level, with the probable exception of pH and oxygen, which may be in the whole scheme of things the least significant of them, showed sites with poor status, meaning high pollution. Pollution tended to be highest, not unexpectedly, in the wet season due to increased discharge of runoff, sewage, wastewater, effluent, solid waste, etc. during this period. Coastal waters showed high level of fecal contamination throughout, most likely associated with untreated or partially treated domestic wastewater. And these pollution hotspots were often found in localized areas, river mouths, sewer outfalls. A general conclusion that wastewater does continue to pose a serious threat to the marine environment, and I would add then to our efforts to adopt a blue economy approach, or to orient our economies so that they are more ocean-based. Although the projections in this study were a little less than the 85% that is often quoted, 63, 65, 70% of untreated wastewater entering the marine environment and entering the Caribbean Sea is still significant and has direct negative impacts on human health and on the environment. So the typical situation is that only 20% of the wastewater in the Caribbean is collected. And of that, the original early figures demonstrated that as much as 80 to 85% entered untreated or partially treated. With the efforts that we have made recently, we're seeing the signs that maybe that percentage is dropping. But we still need to do some analysis and see what is really the situation. But there's no doubt, whether it's 60%, 65%, or 85%, untreated wastewater is still the number one direct source of pollution to Caribbean marine ecosystems. Now, shifting a bit to probably what has become the most topical pollutant in recent times, and that's plastics. And to give a bit of an overview again of some of the challenges, some of the issues, some of the opportunities. Plastics are discharge, particularly from ineffluent from sewage and stormwater generated in urban areas. Coastal tourism and commercial fishing are estimated to cause about 20% of the plastic pollution that we're seeing in the Caribbean Sea. But important to highlight that the packaging, 40%, particularly packaging for single and short-term use, is the major source of plastics. There's some aspects, some areas that are still, we don't know. In the developed countries, it was identified that personal care items such as facial cleansers, toothpaste had significant amounts of plastic microbeads, as much as 1,000 per item. Unsure, is that an issue for us? Are we still using personal care items that have microbeads? And some modeling suggests that the number of floating microplastics, etc., in the wider Caribbean region is about 82,000 pieces, making it one of the highest in the world in terms of contamination. And as I've mentioned, not only do these pollutants from solid and liquid waste impact on human health, most importantly, they threaten our future economic aspects and our wish as a region to embrace ocean-based economies and a blue economy approach. We've seen the importance of tourism, we've seen the importance of fishing and the potential of aquaculture. And I'd like to emphasize, and this is so critical, a blue economy is heavily dependent on a clean environment and healthy and productive marine ecosystems. We will not have a successful Caribbean blue economy unless we address the issue of pollution and solid and liquid waste management. So when we talk blue economy, what do we mean in its broadest sense? And we're talking about yes, conserving marine life and oceans, but we're also talking about creating jobs and reducing poverty and ending hunger. We're talking about using smarter shipping so that the impacts on both marine life as well as air pollution are reduced. It has to be inclusive. We have to look at issues of sustainable fisheries. We have to look at how do you protect small islands and coastal communities from the impacts of climate change. We have to enforce and regulate, whether it's enforcing against illegal fishing or enforcing against dumping. These actions have to be taken. And then we have to be explore outside of the box. What potentials are there for harnessing renewable energy, for looking at mariculture, for exploring what new opportunities can the blue economy provide for the Caribbean. We need to find the entry points that suggest that as the most tourism dependent region, perhaps the tourism sector is one that we need to embrace. We've seen the increase in plastics in some countries from their waste characterization studies of 5% to as high as 35%. A lot of that coming in imported packaging. What can we do as a region to change, to make that paradigm shift, to not just only ban single-use plastics, but look at ways of generating alternatives that are safer. The region has been bombarded, I would say, with a number of waste to energy proposals. And it's not to say that this is not to be totally ignored. We have to look at all of the potential solutions to improving solid and liquid waste management. And I like the term waste to value because it means that we have to consider refusing and, working upstream as it relates to the design of certain products. So we design out single-use plastics, but we have to see recycling may not be favorable or suitable for all aspects. So we have to see what can we recycle within our markets, and maybe waste to energy within a very limited scope is possible and something that should be explored. But we've definitely seen the governments in the region demonstrating the political will through the banning and restriction of plastics and styrofoam. Unfortunately, the current pandemic has, in some quarters slowed down those efforts because now we're balancing safety and the importance of single-use plastics, especially for the frontline medical workers. But you've seen some studies that suggest that not always the case, and it shouldn't be an excuse for us to slow down on our efforts to deal with single-use plastic waste. There are some core challenges that pervade the industry. We have inadequate systems of integrated waste management. Many countries are still facing poor collection, poor recycling, poor reuse, and poor recovery. And I mustn't forget that we're not only dealing with land-based sources of waste, we're also dealing with port reception facilities, our commercial ports, as well as our recreational marinas who have to receive both solid and liquid waste. Are we putting in place the necessary systems to deal with this? We're also looking at the issue of lack of data and information, particularly relevant now as we look at do we have appropriate alternatives? Do we know the impacts? Do we understand what it means to change to bioplastics? Do we have to be conscious of greenwashing? Do we have appropriate business models that would engender the involvement of our business community, our entrepreneurs? What impacts are some of these bans or these alternatives having on our small and medium enterprises? And what systems do we need in place to encourage greater involvement of the private sector? And importantly, as governments, the enabling environment needs to be there to facilitate the integration of improved waste management with ocean-based economies and with a blue economy approach. And that has to happen initially at the policy, legislative, and regulatory level. Incentives frameworks, disincentives, we have to move away from this very sector-based approach. If we are embracing blue economy, we're embracing ocean-based economies, then we need to embrace all those issues that potentially are impacting on it now and have the potential to impact on us maximizing on it in the future. You have to change the narrative, through awareness, through attitude, through changing of attitudes, changing of behaviors, and it has to be there at the highest level in terms of the political agenda. How do we change that narrative? And this is a critical question, and I've provided a couple of ideas. They're not, there are more. Not all of them are relevant for every jurisdiction, but I think it's important that we start considering them. The first is the circular economy. Simply put, maximizing the use of resources and preventing waste generation. So aspects relating to recycling, to upcycling, more sustainable primary materials, energy generation from waste is all part of that circular economy discussion. Nature-based solutions, using our natural ecosystems, constructed wetlands for wastewater treatment, green infrastructure for rainwater control. And then the whole aspect of reduce, reuse, recycle for sustainable water and wastewater management. The opportunities for treated wastewater reuse and irrigation, particularly if it's for non-edible or non-portable purposes, could be for industrial cooling. And as we look at sustainable agriculture, then we also look at nutrient efficiency. We can look at the extraction of the nutrients from the wastewater and then use them back in sustainable agriculture, improving the land use and reducing on the impacts of sedimentation and runoff into the marine environment. And ultimately, all of that has to be linked with some form of sustainable financing mechanism. How are we going to finance this? And we have to start thinking broader, thinking of innovative financing mechanisms. We've heard of blue bonds and green bonds and a variety of both public and private sector partnerships, tariff reform that has to take place in the water sector. So this really has to be a comprehensive approach that looks at the real cost of waste management, the real cost of wastewater management, and how best do we internalize those costs and ensure that we are getting the value for money that we need. And the nature-based solutions now are tried and tested, constructed wetlands, green urban spaces, bioswales, mangroves being used, reforestation, and even the use of natural wetlands. All of these are very much workable solutions, more cost-effective, and at the same point in time address issues of pollution. So how can we improve waste management while at the same time promoting a blue economy? We have to take an ecosystems-based management approach. We have to consider source to sea. For many of us who live in small islands, that's a no-brainer. Watershed to beaches is something that has to be integrated. The more challenging one that has been promoted more in developed countries so far, but it's something now we have to consider as developing countries, as small islands, is sustainable consumption and production. And that's where now it gets to the heart of attitude and behavior and values. We have to look at our accounting that really values our natural assets, our beaches, our coral reefs, our forests. What do those assets mean in the context of blue economy? Blue economy is in fact based primarily on this natural capital. And we have to bridge that gap, the gap between the scientists, the researchers, the policymakers, and bring into that discussion our private sector, whether it be individual businesses or umbrella associations. That dialogue is critical. So the approaches that are being advocated most recently by not just the United Nations Environment Program, but many of the UN agencies is really towards more integration. And many of the new tools that are being advocated for, whether it be marine spatial planning, ecosystem-based management, or integrated coastal zone management, recognize that these are not purely environmental issues. These are not purely marine issues. These need to foster dialogue from a fisheries perspective, from a maritime and shipping perspective, from an energy perspective, from an agricultural perspective, coastal development, environment, and other sectors. And this is particularly critical for small islands if we are going to really maximize this blue economy. So what do we still need? We still need education and awareness that has to be constant, and it has to be across multiple dimensions. Primary school, secondary school, tertiary. We have to institutionalize this. We have to continue that training, whether it be through massive open online courses or training. We have to get it into our university system. Too often, waste is still being looked at as an end of pipe treatment. We deal with the problem after it's a problem, and we have to look more at prevention at source, at minimization. We often say we can't manage what we can't monitor, and it applies to the issue of waste and wastewater management and pollution and the impacts on lives, livelihoods, ecosystems as well. We need to have the monitoring capacity. How much pollution is entering the environment? How much waste is untreated? What direct socioeconomic impacts? Can we quantify those impacts in dollars and cents? And how are we as governments then responding to that in terms of the policy and legislative changes that need to take place? And this can only be done in partnerships. This is now not an issue solely for governments or for private sector or for development banks or NGOs. It's really, to use the term in Jamaica, it's about joined up approaches that recognize that all the stakeholders, including civil society, need to be part of the conversation, need to be part of the discussion in identifying the problems, in identifying the potential solutions. What might be the challenges in certain approaches? As I've said earlier, not one size fits all in this region that is as complex as others. And as we look to engage those partnerships, let's also look to build the capacity. Let's not simply adopt a technology, but adopt, adapt, and innovate, and where possible, develop our own. The skill set is there. Now we need to look at the opportunity to get our entrepreneurs involved, to get our small and medium enterprises involved, so that they see direct economic benefits from a blue economy approach, but also from addressing the issue of pollution and wastewater management. And that's the point I really want to bring home and end with, that it's about utilizing a challenge, an issue. If you remember the first image of pollution, and here I have an example of Recycle It, a company in Jamaica that's taking plastics and repurposing and doing something that has value. We have an example from Suriname in the bottom picture, again, taking something and making value and generating new livelihood opportunities. That is what blue economy and waste management means. And I've made reference on a couple of times to our work. I work with the UNEP Regional Seas Program for the Caribbean, based in Jamaica, the Cartegena Convention Secretariat. And our role is really about protecting the Caribbean Sea, but not for protection's sake, but as you see there, for economic growth and sustainable livelihood. So it's about sustainably developing and using our coastal and marine resources in a way that benefits all while maintaining that resource. And therefore we could say, well, we've been doing blue economy approaches without it being called that. And now I think it allows us really an opportunity to focus on the importance of our oceans. So my final slide is a term that has been used by our own executive director and by the UN Secretary General as we battle this COVID-19 crisis, and it is a crisis. It is an opportunity to build back better, and to quote particularly the UN climate chief, an opportunity for nations to green their recovery packages and shape the 21st century economy in ways that are clean, green, healthy, safe, and more resilient. And therefore, circular economy now is really about a broader cycle. Refuse what we don't need, and coming right down to the issue of the raw materials. Reform in the design of products. Designing for sustainability is the term that's now used. So you don't design single-use plastic items. You reduce use. Generally, you reduce our consumption patterns so that our consumption patterns are then more sustainable. Then you look for the opportunities of reuse, of recycle. You look to improve your collection. so that at the end of the day, what you have to dispose of is really minimal, and therefore the potential impacts on our coastal and marine ecosystems are minimized, therefore enhancing our opportunity for blue economy approaches. So with that, again, I'd like to thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity, and I am open to any questions that you might have. Thank you so much.